People think nothing happens at a palace gate. They think we just stand there, boots polished, chin up, eyes forward like we're carved out of the same stone as the wall behind us. And most days that's true. Most days the biggest thing that happens is a tourist trying to make you blink. But I'll tell you about a day that wasn't most days. I'd been a guardsman at Highmoor for 14 years by then, long enough to know the sound of the gates before they opened, long enough to know which footsteps in the courtyard belonged to who, and long enough to know that when the air at a palace changes, it changes fast, and you don't always get a warning. That morning, I got no warning at all. It was late spring in Calderbridge, the kind of morning that fools you, cold to start, then warm by 10, the sky that soft washed blue you only get a few weeks a year. The cherry trees along the east wall had dropped half their blossom and the whole forecourt was dusted pink. Pretty as a postcard. The cleaning staff hated it, petals everywhere. The crowd was already thick outside the railings. There always was, this time of year, tourists with their hats and their water bottles and their phones held up like little glass shields. A school group in matching yellow caps, the teachers counting heads over and over. A man trying to get his toddler to wave at me. The toddler was more interested in a pigeon. I remember a woman near the front, older, silver hair under a green scarf, who'd been coming for years. She always brought boiled sweets and offered one to whichever of us was on the corner post. Against the rules to take it, of course. She knew that. She offered anyway. It had become a sort of joke between us without a single word ever passing. "Morning," she mouthed at me that day, and held up the little paper bag. I didn't move, eyes forward, but I let the corner of my mouth go just a fraction. She grinned like she'd won something. That's the kind of morning it was, soft, ordinary, nothing in it. The Crown Prince was in residence, Prince Tobias. Everyone knew it, because the standard was up on the pole above the center block. The household was busy that week. Some gathering of the trade delegations, lots of black cars coming and going, lots of people in suits who walked too fast and looked at no one. And the little one was home too. Princess Elspeth, 7 years old, the Crown Prince's daughter. You weren't supposed to have favorites. We didn't officially. But I'll be honest with you, every man on that wall had a soft spot for that child. She was the sort of kid who waved at the guards like we were old friends. Who once, when she was maybe 4, had marched up to the youngest of us and asked, very seriously, whether the bearskin caps were itchy. He hadn't been allowed to answer. She'd patted his boot like she understood and toddled off. Half the household had heard about it by lunch. She had a habit of climbing things. Walls, statues, the low branches of the lime trees in the private garden. Her nannies aged a decade a year, I think. That morning she was somewhere inside, getting fussed over and dressed up, because there was to be a photograph. Some formal thing for the delegation, the family on the steps, everyone smiling. The press allowed in for 10 controlled minutes and not 1 second more. I knew about it because of the boy. Owen Hartley, that was the boy's name. He was new, 21, maybe 22. He'd come up from a farming county somewhere out west, and you could still hear it in his vowels. Quiet lad, almost too quiet. The kind who did everything by the book because he was terrified of getting it wrong, not because he was clever. I'd been told to keep an eye on him, bring him along, so I had. I'll tell you the truth about Owen. At first I didn't think much of him. He was stiff. He held himself like the uniform was wearing him instead of the other way round. The older men teased him, the way older men do, and he took it without a word, which only made them worse. But there was one thing about Owen I noticed early, and it turned out to matter. He watched. Most of us, after enough years, we let the eyes glaze. The crowd becomes a blur of color and noise. You're alert, but you're not really seeing. Owen hadn't learned that yet. He saw everything. He'd tell me afterward when we came off post, that man in the gray jacket came back 3 times, or the bin by the south gate's been overflowing 2 days. Little things, nothing things. I used to think it was nerves. Now I think it was just how he was built. That morning he was posted near the inner arch, the one that leads from the public forecourt toward the family's private wing. Not the front-of-house posts where the tourists gather, a quieter spot, where staff and family pass through. A boring post, honestly. We gave it to the new ones because nothing ever happened there. So you understand, Owen, Hartley wasn't even meant to be near the story. He just happened to be standing where he could see. It was about 9:30 when the first odd thing happened. A door I'll not name, one of the side doors from the private wing opened, and a child came out. Now children don't come out that door alone. Ever. There's always someone. A nanny, a dresser, a member of the household. Someone whose whole job that morning was to keep one small girl clean and calm and ready for a photograph. But the child came out alone. It was Elspeth. And she wasn't running the way she usually ran. She was walking, slow, careful, with her arms held a little out from her sides, the way you walk when you've spilled something on yourself and you're trying not to make it worse. Owen told me later he knew something was wrong before he could even say what. She doesn't walk like that, he said. She never walks like that. He'd only been on the post a few weeks, and already he knew how the child walked. That's the watching, you see. She was in the photograph dress, pale, almost cream, some delicate fabric the household had probably argued about for a week. And down the front of it, from the chest to the hem, was a long dark stain. Owen said his first thought was paint. His second thought was juice. His third thought, the one that turned his stomach over, came when she got close enough that he could see her face. She'd been crying, quietly, the way children cry when they've decided crying won't help and they're going to be brave instead. And she was holding one hand cupped against the other, pressed to her stomach, like she was carrying something she didn't want to drop. "Are you all right, Princess?" Owen asked. "Now you're not really meant to speak, not unless you have to, but there are moments the rule book doesn't cover, and a small girl walking alone with a stain down her dress is one of them." Owen knew that much. She looked up at him, and she said something he didn't understand at first. "Don't tell," she whispered. "Please don't tell, I'll get her in trouble." Now stop and think about that for a second, the way Owen did. A 7-year-old, alone, hurt, because he could see now that the dark stain was wet, and it was spreading, and it was coming from her hand, from a cut across 2 of her small fingers, a cut deep enough that it had run down and soaked into the front of that pale dress. Blood, not paint, not juice. And the first thing out of her mouth wasn't "it hurts." It was "don't tell, I'll get her in trouble." Owen knelt down, slowly. He told me he kept his voice very soft, the way you'd talk to a frightened animal. "Princess," he said, "I'm not going to be cross with anyone, but I have to look at your hand. Can you show me?" She shook her head, tears coming faster now. "Please," he said, "I think it hurts, and I think if we don't look at it, it'll hurt more." She held it out. He told me he'd seen worse on the farm. A torn hand is a torn hand, blood looks like more than it is. But it wasn't nothing. 2 fingers, a clean deep slice, the kind you get from glass or a blade, still bleeding. She'd been holding pressure on it herself without knowing that's what she was doing, just clutching it, and that's probably the only reason it hadn't been worse. "How did this happen?" he asked. And here's where the morning tipped over. Because she wouldn't say. She just kept whispering it. "Don't tell, I'll get her in trouble." Owen Hartley had a decision to make, and he had about 3 seconds to make it. He could follow the soft instinct, keep the child calm, take her quietly to someone, keep it small. That's what she was begging him to do. That's what would have been easiest. Or he could do the thing his training screamed at him, the thing that would absolutely, definitely cause an enormous amount of trouble. He could raise the alarm. Because a member of the royal family, a child, was injured and unaccounted for and frightened. And the one rule that sits above all the other rules is that you do not sit on that. Not ever. You don't decide it's small. You report it and you let the people whose job it is decide how big it is. He looked at her. This little girl, bleeding into her best dress, more scared of getting someone else in trouble than of her own torn hand. And he chose the rule. "I'm sorry," he said to her, quietly. He meant it. "I have to tell, not because I'm cross, because that's my job and your hand needs more than I can do. But I promise no one's getting in trouble for you being hurt. All right, you haven't done anything wrong." She started to cry properly then, and he did the only thing he could. He took off one glove, took her good hand in his, and he raised the other arm and he called it in. Loud, clear, the way you're drilled to. Across the forecourt, on my post by the corner, I heard it. 14 years and you learn the sounds. You learn the difference between a guard calling routine and a guard calling because something is wrong. There's a thing that gets into the voice. I can't describe it, but every man on that wall heard it, and every man on that wall went cold at the same instant. I didn't know what it was yet. I only knew the color of it. The silver-haired woman with the boiled sweets, she saw my face change. She stopped grinning. She put the little paper bag back in her pocket and she didn't take it out again. What happened next happened fast, and I only saw pieces of it. So I'll tell you the pieces I saw and the pieces Owen told me after, and you'll have to stitch them together the way I did. Within a minute there were people moving. Not running, they're trained not to run, because running makes a crowd panic, and a panicking crowd outside a palace is its own emergency. But that fast walk, the black suit walk, half a dozen of them converging on the inner arch from doors I didn't even know existed. A woman from the household reached Elspeth first and took her gently, and the child went, still crying, still saying her little refrain that nobody yet understood, "Don't tell. Don't tell," and they took her inside, and a door closed, and that was the last the public ever saw of any of it. The crowd outside barely noticed. A ripple, maybe. A few people sensed something and turned. But the photograph was still scheduled, the gates were still shut, the standard still hung from the pole. From the railings it looked like nothing. Inside it was already an earthquake. Because the question that everyone was now asking, the question that had begun, very quietly, to harden the air of the whole palace, was a simple one. Where had the child been, and who had been with her? A 7-year-old does not get a deep cut across 2 fingers and end up walking alone and bleeding through a private door by accident. Somebody was supposed to have been holding that morning together. Somebody whose entire responsibility that day was that one small girl. And that somebody was nowhere to be found. I need to tell you now about the person at the center of all this. Because you're going to want to hate her, and it's more complicated than that, and I'd rather you had the truth. Her name was Lady Sabine Thorne. She was formidable, a senior figure at court, not family by blood but close enough to it that she carried real weight. She'd been around the household for years. She organized things. She had opinions and people listened to them, and she was used to being listened to. The kind of woman who could clear a room just by walking into it and knew it and used it. The staff were frightened of her. I'll be plain about that. The dressers, the nannies, the junior staff, they walked on glass around Lady Thorne. She had a way of finding fault. A way of making a young woman feel 2 inches tall over a crooked hem or a late tray. And she had a temper she only ever showed downward, never to the family, never to anyone above her, only ever to the people who couldn't answer back. That morning the photograph had been her show, her arrangement. She'd taken charge of getting the child ready, overruled the regular nanny, sent the girl off to fetch something, decided she'd manage Elspeth herself because she wanted it done her way. And then she'd got distracted. A delegation matter, a phone call, something about the seating on the steps, something she decided was more important. And she'd left a 7-year-old alone, for 10 minutes, in a room she had no business leaving her alone in. A room with, among other things, a tray of glasses set out for the morning. You can see it, can't you? You don't need me to draw it. A bored child, a shiny tray, curiosity, a glass that slips, a small hand that reaches to catch it. And then a little girl, alone, bleeding, terrified not of the cut but of the woman, because she'd watched that woman make grown adults flinch. Because in her 7-year-old mind, the worst thing in the world wasn't the blood on her dress. It was that Lady Thorne would be angry. At her, or at someone, and either way it would be her fault. Don't tell, I'll get her in trouble. That's what she meant. She thought she was protecting someone. She didn't even fully understand who. She just knew that something had gone wrong on Lady Thorne's watch, and that bad things rolled downhill in that house, and that she didn't want to be the cause of more of them. A 7-year-old learned that. Inside a palace. That's the part that got me when I finally understood it, not the cut. The lesson she'd already learned about how that place worked. Owen, meanwhile, was in trouble of his own. Or he thought he was, because that's what happens. You raise the alarm, you bring the whole machine down, and for the first hour nobody stops to say well done. They're too busy. The boy stood there on his post, sweating under that cap, certain he'd overreacted, certain he'd be hauled in and asked who he thought he was, a 3-weeks-in-farm lad making a scene over a scraped hand. I found a moment to get near him. Against the rules to chat on post, I did it anyway. "Owen," I said low, eyes forward, "you called that in?" "Yes, Sergeant." His voice was tight. She was hurt, she was alone, I didn't know what else." "You did right," I said. He didn't answer. I don't think he believed me. "You did right, lad," I said again. "Whatever they say to you in the next hour, whatever it costs you, you hear me. You looked at a hurt child and you didn't look away and you didn't make it small. That's the whole job, that's all of it. Everything else is just standing still." He swallowed, eyes forward, but I saw his jaw move. What neither of us knew yet, what nobody on that wall knew yet, was that the Crown Prince had just been told. And the Crown Prince was on his way down. I have stood that wall through a great many things. State funerals, a fire in the South Wing, one winter, a man who got over the railing once and made it 40 yards before 3 of us put him on the ground. I have heard the bells rung for a death and rung for a birth. But I have never, before or since, felt the air of a palace, do what it did when word went round that Prince Tobias had been told his daughter was hurt, and that he was coming down himself, on foot, fast, and that nobody had dared try to stop him. You felt it before you saw it. The household scattering, doors, that black suit walk breaking finally into something faster. A voice somewhere calling for someone, and another voice saying she's been found, she's all right, and the first voice not slowing at all because all right and unhurt are not the same word and a father knows the difference. I was at my corner post. I could see the long colonnade that runs down from the family's wing toward the inner court, and I saw him come down it. I'd seen the Crown Prince 100 times, calm man usually, measured, the sort who you'd never catch out of step. Not that morning. That morning he came down that colonnade like a storm with somewhere to be, coat open, not looking at a single one of the people trying to keep pace with him and brief him as he went. One question, over and over, and you could read it on his mouth even from where I stood. "Where is she? Where is she? Where is she?" And behind that question, gathering, building, you could see the other thing rising in him. The thing that comes after the fear, once you know the child is safe. The thing that turns and looks for a reason. Who let this happen? I have a daughter myself. She's grown now. But I remembered watching him, the exact shape of that feeling, the way the terror, the second it's allowed to, curdles into a fury so clean and so total it frightens you from the inside. Prince Tobias was about 10 seconds from the room where his daughter sat with a bandaged hand and a ruined dress, and a head full of don't tell. And Lady Sabine Thorne, wherever she'd finally surfaced from, whatever phone call she'd finally finished, was about to find out that there was, after all, one person in that palace she could not make flinch. I didn't see what happened in that room. But I heard about it, every word. And I'll tell you all of it. I told you I'd give you every word. So here's how I came to have them. There's a man called Henrik Voss, was the Crown Prince's private secretary at the time and a friend of mine, as much as a man in his position can have friends down on the wall. We'd come up together years back before he went one way into the offices and I stayed on the stone. He was in that room, not by choice, by the simple fact that he couldn't get out of it in time, and once it started, you didn't leave. It was Henrik who told me that same night, sitting in the little staff room behind the guardhouse with a cold cup of tea going colder between his hands, exactly what happened. He told it slowly. He kept stopping. I think he needed to say it out loud as much as I needed to hear it. So this part isn't mine, it's his. I'm just the one carrying it to you. The room they'd taken Elspeth to was a small sitting room off the family's private wing. Yellow walls, a view of the lime trees. The household physician had come quickly. There's always one near, in a house like that, and he'd cleaned the cut and closed it, 2 small butterfly strips and a proper dressing, and told the women in the room that it looked far worse than it was, which is the truest thing anyone says about a bleeding hand. The dress was gone by then. Someone had got her into something soft and ordinary. The pale dress was in a heap somewhere, and I don't know what became of it, and I never asked. Elspeth had stopped crying. She'd gone into that flat, quiet place children go when the worst of the fright has passed and the tiredness comes in behind it. She was sitting on a low sofa with her bandaged hand in her lap, and a nanny, the regular one, the one Lady Thorne had overruled that morning, was kneeling beside her, not saying much, just there. And that's the room Prince Tobias walked into. Henrik said he'd never forget the way the prince stopped in the doorway. All that speed, all that storm coming down the colonnade, and then he saw her, saw she was sitting up, saw she was whole, and the whole thing just Henrik searched for the word collapsed. Not weakness. The opposite. The fear had been holding him up like scaffolding, and the moment he saw she was safe, the scaffolding came down and what was left underneath was just a father. He crossed the room and he knelt in front of her, and he didn't say anything clever or grand. He said, "Hello, Trouble," which was apparently what he always called her, and the little girl looked at her father and her face crumpled all over again, but soft this time, relieved, and she put her good arm around his neck and he held the back of her head with one hand the way you do with a small child, and for a moment that was the whole room. Henrik said 3 grown adults had to look at the floor. Then Elspeth, into her father's shoulder, said the thing she'd been saying all morning, the thing that had baffled Owen and baffled the household and that nobody had yet managed to understand. "Don't be cross with her, Papa, please, it was my fault, don't be cross with her." And Prince Tobias went very still. He held his daughter a moment longer. Then he leaned back gently so he could see her face, and he said soft, careful, because he could feel he was standing near the edge of something, cross with who, sweetheart. And the little girl told him. I'll tell it the way Henrik told it to me, because the order matters. The way it came out of her, in pieces, in the small flat voice of a tired child who thinks she's the one who's done wrong. She told him about the morning, about how Lady Thorne had sent her own nanny away. She said you weren't doing it properly, Elspeth reported, not understanding that this was a stone she was dropping, and decided to get her ready herself for the photograph. She told him about the room with the glasses, how Lady Thorne had gone out to take a telephone call, how she'd said wait there and don't touch anything and don't get yourself dirty 3 times in the voice. You know the one, the child said, the voice that means she's already crossed before anything's even happened. She told him how she'd waited. How long, she didn't know. A long time to a 7-year-old, long enough to get bored, long enough to start swinging her feet and then to get up and then to wander the way children do toward the one thing in the room that caught the light. The tray of glasses. She hadn't meant to take one. She just wanted to look. And one was near the edge and she touched it to turn it, to see the light go through it, and it tipped, and she grabbed for it the way you grab for a falling thing without thinking, and it broke in her hand. And here Henrik said, the little girl's voice dropped to almost nothing. And I knew she'd be so cross, because I touched it when she said not to, and I didn't want her to be cross, so I tried to clean it up myself so she wouldn't know, but it kept bleeding and it got on my dress and then I couldn't make it stop and I got scared and I just wanted to find a guard, because the guards are kind, so I went to find a guard. She looked up at her father. The young one was nice to me. He said no one was in trouble, but I think he had to tell, and now everyone knows, and she's going to be so cross. Henrik said you could have heard a clock tick in another building. Because there it was, the whole thing, laid out by a 7-year-old who still, even now, even safe in her father's arms, believed the disaster of the morning was that she disobeyed and made a mess, and that a grown woman would be angry at her for it. A child had cut herself badly, alone, frightened, and her instinct, her trained instinct, had not been to find help. It had been to hide it, to clean it up before the adult came back, so she wouldn't be in trouble. That is not how a 7-year-old is supposed to think. A 7-year-old is supposed to run to the nearest adult screaming. That's the healthy thing. That's what the fear is for. The fact that this child's first move had been concealment, had been to manage the feelings of the adult responsible for her, told you everything you needed to know about what it had been like to be in Lady Sabine Thorne's care. Henrik said he watched the prince understand it, watched it land, and he said the thing that frightened him most wasn't anger. He'd seen the prince angry, cold, clipped, controlled. This wasn't that. The prince kissed his daughter's head and he said very gently, "You haven't done a single thing wrong. Do you understand me? Not one thing. You're the bravest person in this whole palace and I am so proud of you." And he kept his voice soft and warm for her all the way through, never let her see anything else. And then he stood up, and he turned around, and Henrik said the warmth came off him like a coat dropping to the floor. "Where is Lady Thorne?" the prince said. It wasn't a question. Henrik said it didn't go up at the end. It just landed, flat and heavy, in the middle of the room. Now, here is where I have to be fair to you and fair to her, because I told you it was more complicated than just hatting her, and I meant it. Lady Sabine Thorne was not a monster. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to make her one, and that's not the truth. She was a proud, capable, frightened woman who had spent her whole life making sure no one ever caught her short. She'd built her position out of being the one who never dropped anything, never let a detail slip, never gave anyone above her a reason to doubt her. And the cost of being that, the cost of it landing on everyone below her, hard, for years, that cost was real and other people paid it, mostly young women who couldn't fight back. But I think when she walked into that room she still believed she could manage it. That's the thing about people like that. They've managed their way out of everything their whole lives. She'd convinced herself, in the time it took to walk down the corridor, that this was a small thing handled badly by panicky staff. A child cut her hand. Children cut their hands. She'd have a tidy explanation. She'd been called away on a matter of genuine importance, the delegation, the seating, real responsibilities, and someone should have been watching the girl, and she would, regretfully, have to look into who had failed. She came into that room ready to redirect the blame downward, the way she always had, the way it had always worked. She did not understand yet that the ground had moved. She came in fast, talking before she was fully through the door. Henrik said that was the first mistake, that she filled the silence instead of reading it. "Your Royal Highness, I came the moment I want you to know I take full responsibility for the oversight. The girl was left in the care of." "Stop it." One word. The prince. Henrik said it cut her clean off, and that Lady Thorne's mouth actually stayed open a moment around the rest of the sentence she didn't get to say. "You take full responsibility," the prince said, quiet, terribly quiet. "Go on then. Tell me what you're taking responsibility for. Say it out loud, in front of her. And he didn't gesture, but everyone understood he meant the child, sitting right there on the sofa, watching, because nobody had thought to take her out, and now it was too late. Lady Thorne's eyes flicked to Elspeth, and Henrik said you could see her recalculate, see her realize the child was a witness, and a witness who'd already talked, because why else would the room feel like this? There was an accident, she said carefully, a glass I had stepped out to attend to. You sent her nanny away. The prince's voice didn't rise. That was the awful part, Henrik said. It never once rose. You decided you knew better. You took a 7-year-old child as your responsibility, and then you left her alone in a room with broken glass to take a telephone call about chairs. It wasn't. And she cut her hand open, still quiet, still level. And do you know what she did, Lady Thorne? Do you know what my daughter did when she was bleeding and alone and frightened? Silence. She tried to hide it. The prince let that sit. She tried to clean it up herself, because she was more afraid of you being angry than she was of her own hand. A child, my child, bleeding, and her first thought was you and your temper. Henrik said that was the moment Lady Thorne's face changed, because there was no managing that. There was no tidy explanation that survived it. The child's own behavior was the evidence, and it was evidence of years, not of one morning. She came to that conclusion somewhere, the prince said. She learned it somewhere, that mistakes in this house are met with anger and that the safest thing is to hide them. She's 7. She learned that from someone. He looked at her. I think we both know from whom. And then Lady Thorne made her last mistake, the one she couldn't come back from. She tried to go downward, one more time. The reflex was too deep in her to stop. With respect, sir, she said, and her voice had gone hard now, the court voice, the one that made dressers flinch. The child was disobedient. I told her not to touch the tray, repeatedly, if she had simply done as she was told. It was the wrong room to use that voice in, the wrong man, the wrong day. Henrik said the prince crossed the floor. Not fast. He just closed the distance until there was no comfortable space left between them, and he looked down at her. He had the height on her, and he said something very low, just for her, that Henrik only half caught. But the half he caught was this. You will not stand in front of my injured daughter and tell me it's her fault. And then louder for the room. You're finished here, today, now. I want you out of this house by the end of the day, and I do not want you to come back into it. Not for the delegation, not for the photograph, not for anything. Henrik will see to the arrangements. You'll be treated with the dignity you did not extend to anyone who worked beneath you, because that's the standard of this house, even when individual people fall short of it. A breath. You fell short of it, badly. For a long time, I suspect. I should have seen it sooner. Henrik said. Lady Thorne stood there a moment. And the strangest thing, he said, it wasn't defiance on her face at the end. It was something closer to bewilderment. Like a woman who'd been speaking a language her whole life and had just discovered, in one terrible moment, that everyone around her had stopped understanding it. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. She gave a small, stiff bow, the manners held even when nothing else did, and she turned and she walked out. Henrik went with her because someone had to, and because the prince had told him to see it done properly. That was the last time Lady Sabine Thorne was inside Highmoor Palace. Now you'd think that was the end of it. The villain removed, the child safe, the storm passed. But there was one more thread, and it was the one that mattered most to me, because it was about the boy. Because in all of this, the confrontation, the removal, the household holding its breath, there was a small detail that hadn't been forgotten. The prince hadn't forgotten it. In the middle of his fury, in the middle of everything, his daughter had said one thing that lodged in him. The young one was nice to me. He said no one was in trouble. The young one. Later that afternoon, Henrik told me this part too, with a different look on his face, a softer one. The prince asked a single question of his staff. He asked who the guardsman was, the one at the inner arch, the one his daughter had gone to. And there was a small panic because nobody was quite sure, and then someone worked it out and the answer came back. A new man, 3 weeks in. Hartley. Owen Hartley. The prince asked for him to be sent up. I want you to picture this from Owen's side, because this is the part that still makes me laugh and ache at the same time. The boy had spent the entire day convinced he was about to be dismissed. He'd raised the alarm, brought the whole house down, caused, as far as he could tell, an enormous scene, a senior court figure removed, the prince storming about, the photograph cancelled, the delegation in disarray. And in Owen's 21-year-old farm boy head, all of that was somehow his fault because he was the one who'd shouted. He was the one who'd refused to keep it small. I told him he'd done right. He hadn't believed me. Of course he hadn't. So when the message came down, the crown prince wants to see Hartley, sent up to the family's wing, Owen went the color of the cherry blossom. White, then pink. He looked at me like a man being walked to the gallows. "Sergeant," he said, "what do I?" "You stand up straight," I told him. "You answer what you're asked. You tell the truth. And whatever happens in that room, lad, you walk out of it knowing you did the one thing this whole job is actually for." I straightened his collar for him, which you're not meant to do, and I didn't care. "Go on, don't keep the man waiting." He went. And I stood there on my post in the warm afternoon, with the petals still drifting down off the lime trees, and I'll be honest, I prayed a little. For the boy. That whatever was up those stairs would be kind to him. What happened in that room, Owen told me himself later, and he could barely get it out. His voice kept going. He was brought in. He stood to attention. He stared at a point on the wall the way you're trained to, and the crown prince of Soltern came over and stood in front of him. "You're Hartley," the prince said. "Yes, sir, your royal highness." Owen said, his voice came out like a boy's. "You were on the inner arch this morning." "Yes, sir." "My daughter came to you." And Owen panicked, he told me. He thought this was it, and the words just fell out of him. "Sir, if I overstepped, if I shouldn't have called it, she was hurt, sir, and she was on her own, and I didn't know what else to do. I know I caused a great deal of—" "Hartley," the prince stopped him, gentle, the same gentle he'd used with his daughter, Henrik said, "Look at me, son." Owen looked at him. My daughter walked the length of a corridor, bleeding, frightened, hiding it from everyone, and the first person in this entire palace she trusted enough to show her hand to was you. A man she'd known for 3 weeks. Do you understand what that means? Owen didn't. He shook his head just slightly. "It means," the prince said, "that in 3 weeks standing at a post where you thought nobody was watching, you made a child feel that you were safe, that you were kind, that you would help her and not be angry. She told me the guards are kind. That's what she thinks of you, of all of you. And today she was right because one of you proved it." Owen said he couldn't speak. "You did not overstep," the prince said. "You did precisely the thing I would want every man on that wall to do, and most of them, with respect to your sergeant, have forgotten that it's even the job. You saw a child who needed help and you did not look away, and you did not make it small to save yourself trouble. You made it as big as it needed to be." He paused. "Do you know how rare that is? To not look away when looking away is so much easier." And then the crown prince of Soltern put out his hand to a 3-week guardsman, a farm boy. And he shook it. "Thank you," he said, "for my daughter." Owen came back down to the wall about an hour later. He didn't say anything at first. He just took up his post beside me, eyes forward, chin up, the way he'd been taught. The afternoon crowd had thinned. The silver-haired woman with the boiled sweets had gone home. The standard still hung from the pole, soft in the still air. I let him stand a minute. Then I said, quiet, eyes forward, "Well." And the boy, this stiff, terrified, watching boy who'd held himself all day like the uniform was wearing him, he let out a breath that he must have been holding since 9 that morning. And his shoulders came down. And he said, in a voice that wobbled right at the end and that I pretended not to notice, "He thanked me, Sergeant." I know he did, lad. He shook my hand. I know. We stood there. The petals came down, and I thought to myself that the boy had walked onto that wall 3 weeks ago wearing the uniform, and he'd walk off it that evening with the uniform finally fitting him, and that there's a difference, and that not every man ever finds it. But the day wasn't finished. Because while Owen had been upstairs being thanked, something else had been happening quietly in the offices and corridors of Highmoor. Word of what Lady Thorne had really been, not just the morning, but the years of it, had begun to move. And the young women who'd flinched around her for so long were beginning, very carefully, to lift their heads. And there was a question that the Crown Prince had asked Henrik, late in the afternoon, that was going to change a great deal more than one woman's employment. He'd asked, how many others did she do this to, and why did no one feel they could tell me? That question, it turned out, had a long and uncomfortable answer. And the way the household chose to answer it, that's the rest of the story. I've thought a lot in the years since about that question the prince asked Henrik that afternoon. How many others did she do this to, and why did no one feel they could tell me? It's an easy question to ask. People ask it all the time after the fact, when the bad thing has already happened and they want to look like they care. Most of the time it's just noise. You ask it, you shake your head, you go back to your life and nothing changes, and the next Lady Thorne is already learning the trade somewhere down the corridor. What made it different that day was that the prince actually waited for the answer. And the answer was long, and it took weeks, and it was not comfortable for anybody, least of all him. It started small, it always does. The day after the blood and the dress and the removal, one of the dressers came to Henrik. A young woman. I'll call her Marta, though that wasn't her name. She's still in service and it's not my place. Marta had been with the household 2 years and she came to Henrik's office white as a sheet, twisting her hands, half expecting to be sacked just for knocking on the door. And she told him a thing that had happened to her the winter before. A thing Lady Thorne had said to her, and done to her over a mistake that wasn't even a mistake. Small in the telling, a torn sleeve, a public dressing down in front of the whole staff hall, words that Marta could still repeat, word for word, a year later, because that's how those words work, they bury in and they stay. Henrik listened, he didn't rush her, and when she'd finished she said the thing that I think mattered most. She said, I never told anyone, sir, because who would I tell? She was Lady Thorne, and I'm nobody. I'm nobody. Henrik told me he wrote that down, those 2 words, and he sat looking at them for a long time. Because that was the real rot, you see, not the temper. Tempers come and go. The rot was that an entire house full of decent, hard-working people had quietly agreed, without ever saying it out loud, that some of them were somebody and some of them were nobody, and that the nobodies had no door to knock on. The temper was just what grew in that soil. After Marta, it was like a tap had been turned. Not a flood, these were careful people, frightened people, and they came one at a time, testing the ground. But they came. A footman, 2 more of the dressers, a young man from the kitchens who'd been reduced to tears in front of his colleagues over a cracked plate and had never quite been the same since. The regular nanny, the one Lady Thorne had sent away that morning, who it turned out had been undermined and overruled and belittled for the better part of a year, and had said nothing, because she loved the child and was terrified of being moved away from her. Each one came with the same hesitation, the same flinch, the same expectation that telling the truth would cost them everything. And each one walked out of Henrik's office having lost nothing at all, and that word of that spread faster through the household than any rumor ever had. He listened. He believed them. Nobody was punished for speaking. After years of the opposite, that alone was almost more than some of them could take in. Henrik told me one of them, an older woman who'd been in service longer than I'd been on the wall, sat down across from him and got 3 sentences in and just stopped and put her face in her hands and cried. Not because of anything Lady Thorne had done to her specifically, because someone was finally asking and writing it down, and it had taken so long, and she'd started to believe it never would. Now I want to tell you what the prince did with all of it, because this is the part people get wrong when they imagine these things. He didn't make a spectacle. There was no grand announcement, no speech to the assembled household, no theater of it. That's not how that house worked, and it's not how he worked, and frankly the spectacle is usually for the benefit of the person making it, not the people it's supposed to help. What he did was quieter and harder. He brought in a way for people to be heard that didn't depend on them being brave enough to knock on the private secretary's door. A proper one. Someone whose job it was to listen, who sat outside the chain of who flinches to whom, so that the next time a senior figure made a junior one feel like nobody, there was somewhere for that to go that wasn't straight back to the senior figure. It sounds like a small administrative thing. It wasn't. For the people on the bottom of that house, it was the difference between having a door and not having one. And he did one more thing, which Henrik told me about late one night and which I've never forgotten. He went himself to the staff hall, not for an inspection, not for a speech. He just came down one evening unannounced, and he sat with the staff for a while, the dressers and the footmen and the kitchen people, the nobodies, and he ate what they ate and he listened more than he talked. And before he left he said one thing to the room. Henrik was there, he said. I'm told some of you have not felt able to come to me when things were wrong. That's my failing, not yours. A house is only as good as how it treats the people no one's watching. I didn't watch closely enough. I will now. And then he said good night and went back upstairs, and that was all. Henrik said the room sat in silence for a moment after the door closed. And then the old woman, the one who'd cried in his office, said, to nobody in particular, well, just that. Well. And somebody laughed, the relieved kind of laugh, and the spell broke, and the staff hall of Highmoor Palace felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place where you could breathe. And what of Lady Sabine Thorne? I told you I'd be fair to her, and I'll keep that to the end. She left the house that first evening, as she'd been told, with her dignity carried out in front of her like a tray she was afraid to drop. Henrik saw her to the car. He said she didn't weep, didn't rage, didn't plead. She held herself the way she'd held herself her whole life, straight-backed, chin level, giving nothing away. But at the car, Henrik said, she paused, and she asked him one question, and it surprised him. She asked, is the child all right? Henrik said it caught him off guard because it was the first time all day she'd asked about Elspeth as a child rather than as a problem. He told her yes. The cut was minor. She'd heal. And Lady Thorne nodded once and got into the car and said one more thing before the door closed. Good, she said. I am glad of that at least. And then she was gone. I don't tell you that to make you forgive her. The years of cruelty were real, and the people who carried them are still carrying them, and one decent question at the end doesn't wipe that out. But I tell you because people are not villains all the way through, and I think it's important to remember that the woman who frightened a child into hiding her own blood was also, underneath all of it, capable of being glad the child was well. Both things were true. People are like that. It's the unbearable thing about them. What became of her after, I don't know. She left court and she didn't come back. I heard years later that she'd gone to live with a sister in the country. I hope it was quieter for her there. I hope she had time to think. I don't know that she did. You never do. But I've kept you long enough on the grand business of the house. Let me bring it back down to the wall where I belong and where this story really lives. Because the heart of it was never the court. It was a boy and a little girl. Elspeth healed the way children do, fast and completely. Within a week the dressing was off and there was just a thin pink line across 2 fingers, the kind of scar she'd have for life and forget she had until someone asked. Children are tougher than we give them credit for. They bounce. It's the grown-ups who carry the dents. But there was one thing that didn't heal on its own, and somebody had to tend to it on purpose, and I'm glad to tell you somebody did. The lesson, the wrong thing she'd learned, that mistakes meant anger and the safe thing was to hide them. The prince knew it was there. He'd heard it in her own voice, "Don't tell, I'll get her in trouble," and he was not a man to leave a thing like that sitting in his daughter to grow. So he set about gently over weeks unteaching it. Henrik told me he made a point of it. When the child broke something, and children break things, that's their whole job, he made sure the response she met was never anger. Concern, yes. Was she hurt? Was she safe? And then, things break, sweetheart. It's all right. You tell me when something goes wrong. You always tell me. You're never in trouble for telling the truth. Over and over, until the old lesson was buried under a new one. I think about that as much as I think about anything from that day. A father, in the middle of running a kingdom, taking the time to reach into his small daughter and pull out a bad idea by the root before it could grow into the kind of grown-up who hides her own blood. That's a kind of love that doesn't get put on stamps, but it's the realest kind I know. Now the boy. You'll want to know what became of Owen Hartley, and I'm pleased, more pleased than I can properly say, to be the one to tell you. He did not get promoted the next day. That's not how it works, and it shouldn't be. One good morning doesn't make a soldier, and a wall full of men who have served 20 years would rightly have something to say about a 3-week lad leaping over them on the strength of one handshake. The prince understood that. So did Owen, to his credit. He didn't expect it, and he didn't want it. What he got was quieter and worth more. He got a reputation, not the loud kind, the kind that travels on the wall, man to man, in the way these things travel. That's the Hartley lad, the one the little princess went to, knew his job when it counted, and there is no currency in that world worth more than the quiet respect of the men who stand beside you, and Owen had earned it in 3 weeks in one morning, and he never had to earn it again. He grew into it. The stiffness went. The uniform that had been wearing him started to fit the way I'd hoped it would. He stayed a watcher that never left him, thank God, but he stopped being a frightened one. He'd found out, you see, the thing it takes some men a whole career to find out and some never do, that the rules and the kindness aren't enemies. That the whole point of standing still and silent on that wall, the entire reason for all the drill and the discipline and the not blinking, is so that when the one moment comes, the child, the crisis, the thing the rule book can't quite cover, you're steady enough and present enough to meet it. The discipline isn't the job. The discipline is what makes you ready for the job. And the job, when it finally comes, is almost always just this: don't look away. Owen learned that at 21. I've known men to die without learning it. Years on now, he's still in service. Senior man. He trains the new ones, the frightened 3-week lads who hold themselves like the uniforms wearing them, just like he once did. And I'm told, by people who'd know, that there's one thing he says to every single one of them on their first day, before any of the drill or the standing orders or the history of the regiment. He tells them about a morning, a pale dress, a little girl with a cut hand who was more frightened of an angry adult than of her own blood. And he tells them the thing his old sergeant told him, eyes forward on the wall, when he was sure he'd ruined everything. You looked at a hurt child and you didn't look away and you didn't make it small. That's the whole job. That's all of it. Everything else is just standing still. He says it's the most important thing he knows. He says he's never found a better one. I won't pretend that doesn't get me, a little every time I hear it. A man passing down, to boys who weren't even born when it happened, a lesson that started with me, on a soft spring morning, trying to steady a terrified lad who turned out not to need much steadying at all. That's the thing about a wall. You think you're just standing on it, but you're standing on it next to other people, and what you say to them and what you do where they can see, it doesn't stay on the wall. It goes down the line. It goes down the years. I'm an old man now, near enough. I came off the wall a long time ago. The knees went first, the way they always do, and then the rest of me followed, and these days the closest I get to Highmoor is the bench across the road where I sit some mornings and watch the new lot stand their posts and try not to offer them advice they didn't ask for. The cherry trees are still there along the east wall. They still drop their blossom every spring and the cleaning staff still hate it. There's a silver-haired woman with boiled sweets. A different one. The old one passed some years back. But there's always one. There's always somebody who comes and offers a sweet she knows won't be taken. Some things a palace just keeps growing like the trees. Princess Elspeth is grown now. A young woman. I saw her not long ago in a photograph in the paper doing some good and serious work, and there was a moment the way she carried herself, steady and kind and entirely unafraid, where I thought, there she is, the brave one, the one who walked a whole corridor bleeding rather than make a fuss. Except now nobody's taught her to hide anything, and you can see it in her, that openness, that ease. Somebody pulled the bad lesson out by the root before it could grow. And it worked, it took, there she is. I don't suppose she remembers me. There's no reason she should. I was just a man on a corner post, 14 years in, on a morning she'd want to forget anyway. But I remember. I remember the pink light through the petals, and the woman with the sweets, and the standard hanging soft on the pole. I remember the sound of a frightened guard calling it in, and the way every man on the wall went cold at once. I remember a father coming down a colonnade like a storm, and walking back up it a few hours later, having put out the fire in himself for long enough to thank a boy who thought he was about to be dismissed. And I remember a little girl who thought the worst thing in the world was that someone might be cross with her, and a young man who knelt down in front of her and decided, in about 3 seconds, with no rule book to cover it, that she mattered more than his own comfort. That's the day, that's the whole of it. People imagine palaces are about crowns and gold and grand state rooms. They're not. Underneath all of it, a palace is just people, the somebodies and the nobodies, trying to be decent to each other or failing to. That's all anywhere is. And on one soft spring morning, in a small yellow room and on a stone wall under the lime trees, a handful of them chose decent. A boy, a father, an old sergeant, and a little girl braver than all of us, who only ever wanted nobody to be in trouble. I stood a great many days on that wall. Most of them nothing happened. But I was there for the one that mattered, and I didn't look away. And that, in the end, is the most any of us can say.